Good morning or good evening in Hong Kong. Actually, good afternoon in Britain as well. So, very pleased to see a very good turnout. And I have the pleasure today to introduce Dr. Tom McDonald, our colleague at the University of Hong Kong, who's an anthropologist based at the Department of Sociology. So Tom's research focuses on technology and society in China, and his current research investigates the convergence of digital money, credit, and social media. He has published articles in several really prestigious journals such as American Anthropologist, China Quarterly, and the Ethnos. So today he's going to talk about debt at a distance, China's debt collection callers during COVID. So I really look forward to it. And without further ado, I am now passing the floor to Dr. Tom McDonald.
Thank you so much, Loretta. Thank you to Loretta and Gonzalo for the invitation to present at Sci-Tech Asia. It's a real privilege to be here. I'm very honored to have the chance to share kind of some of the work that we've been doing and also to kind of get your ideas about it. So if it's all right, I'll go ahead and share my screen with you because we've prepared a few short slides to kind of entertain you as well. So, the host, you may need to allow me to share my screen, whoever is the host, if that's all right, because it's saying that it's been disabled. Let me try again. Oh, yep, that worked perfectly. And I'll just do that. Fantastic. Can I just check you can see my screen?
Yes, perfect.
Amazing.
Yes, very clear.
Okay, fantastic. Right, so as Loretta said, the paper that we're talking about today and the kind of mini project is called Recontextualising Debt, China's Credit Collection Callers and Anti-Collection Alliance during COVID-19. And actually, I have to be honest, this is kind of a co-authored paper. So Yi-Chen has been working with me to kind of share ideas and develop this paper and the ideas that are in it. And I'll talk a little bit about, both of us have been working in similar fields. I've been doing kind of a lot of work about Huabei and Jiabei, that's Ant Credit Pay and Ant Cash Now, the credit platforms offered by Alipay. And at the same time, Yi-Chen was also kind of doing his PhD fieldwork and writing up on a really fascinating PhD on peer-to-peer lending in China. So kind of we were both coming at credit and debt and lending from different platforms and from different kind of technologies, but then our interest kind of coincided along with the moment the pandemic came. So I'll talk a little bit later on about that when we get further into the methods. But I just wanted to highlight that Yi-Chen's made an enormous contribution to this paper as well. Okay, so without further ado, I will get started. Okay, so I'll start with a story, as anthropologists always do, and it's a story that, in fact, all of us probably know by now. On the 23rd of January 2020, just 2 days before the start of the Chinese New Year holiday, the Chinese central government imposed a lockdown in Wuhan and in other cities in the Hubei province in an effort to contain the COVID-19 outbreak that had occurred in the region. Over the days that followed, the remainder of the country entered into a kind of semi-lockdown, enacting really stringent social distancing measures, all of which were really made possible by the country's social grid management system. These measures were also aided by an emphasis on collectivist values, which mandated citizens to exercise compliance and self-restraint for the greater good of the nation. Responding to what the government actually officially dubbed a containment campaign against the virus, citizens across China duly confined themselves to their homes, apart from, let's say, essential shopping trips for food and medicine and things like that. Coincidentally, at that very moment that the measures were enacted, hundreds of millions of citizens in China had already traveled back to their hometowns and their villages to try to celebrate Chinese New Year with their family. So as travel restrictions both within but also between provinces came into effect, many people actually realized that they were going to be unable to return to the cities where they'd been working, often for extended periods of time. Across the country, workplaces and factories temporarily closed. In many cities, these wouldn't reopen until mid-April, some 2.5 months later. Some, of course, went out of business altogether. Extended workplace closures and subsequent redundancies led actually to a loss of earnings for millions of mostly blue-collar workers. As a result, many individuals in China, and especially those with low incomes who already maybe had tight finances, ended up missing repayments on credit products such as loans and credit cards. And while existing regulations that were already in place in China had already made clear that third-party credit collectors were to refrain from doing things like pressuring debtors through violent means, actually financial institutions nonetheless generally expected credit collectors to still keep on persisting in pursuing repayments from defaulters, even under the pandemic situation. At the same time, faced with the loss of their salaries, these desperate debtors formed what we're calling an anti-credit collection alliance through online platforms in order to try to develop counter strategies against the debt collectors by referring to vague state regulations as being a kind of third-party authority. So by examining how these opposing parties, the debtors and the credit collectors, sought to justify their actions during this period, this paper actually tries to demonstrate the shifting moral contours of credit that are made possible by competing efforts to recontextualize debt. So this paper seeks to explore how Chinese financial institutions and also the third-party credit collectors who are often acting on their behalf attempted to pursue personal debt repayments in the immediate aftermath of the COVID-19 outbreak and the responses that debtors had to these attempts. Now, while there's a growing body of scholarly research on debt collection industries in the West, which has highlighted the moral performativity central to this line of work, the really unprecedented impact of the pandemic and the severity of the control measures that we see enacted, especially in China, raises really specific questions about the ostensibly rigid and calculable obligations for timely repayment that are understood to underpin contemporary forms of interest-bearing credit, as David Graeber said. These interactions are also shaped by the fact that consumer credit in China is increasingly built upon the very same technologies that are propelling an overwhelmingly cashless economy, meaning that interactions between lenders and borrowers are almost exclusively mediated through smartphones and the apps contained therein. So I hope that this is probably going to be the area that is of the greatest interest to the audience for Sci-Tech Asia here. So what we're going to try and do in this paper is to ask how the moral contours of debt are actually shaped by these conflicting imperatives for Chinese citizens to temporarily suspend wage earning labor for the sake of people's war directed towards eliminating the virus, which was stacked against the moral obligations to meet these seemingly endless, unyielding debt repayment schedules. And in the paper, we argue that the COVID-19 crisis actually engendered a really pronounced sense of moral ambiguity around the enacting of debt relations, which debtors and credit collectors responded to by attempting to recontextualize these debts, albeit in very different ways. Debtors drew on the symbolic power of the state and an ideal of public legal commitment as a kind of broader imagination of a more powerful collective responsibility that they saw to exist under the pandemic. Whereas credit collectors on their part invoked an imaginary of family and also of private moral commitment to try to kind of cultivate feelings of shame amongst debtors with the aim of extracting repayments. Okay, so this section of the talk, the first section is going to be called Moral Debts and Moral Collections. Okay, so Graeber, David Graeber, of course, has described the profound moral confusion that actually surrounds contemporary financial monetary debts, which he says results from the transition from an economy of credit that's rooted in moral obligation to an economy of interest in which a creditor has the means to specify numerically exactly how much a debtor owes. Now, Graeber's historical overview of debt, his historical narrative, albeit very compelling, is complicated actually by a growing body of scholarly work that's grounded in an understanding of markets as being moral projects in their own right. And obviously I'm thinking here of work like Fourcade and Healy's work on moral markets. And this kind of work highlights how present-day formal monetary debts often exhibit quite diverse moral underpinnings. This is particularly pertinent to and often comes under direct pressure within this process of credit collections. So Joe Devil has examined the UK credit collection industry at length, and in his work he demonstrates how collectors' efforts directed at persuading debtors to kind of regenerate market attachments with their overdue debts. Devil talks about how credit collectors engage in a kind of what he calls captation, trying to kind of reel in and pull in defaulting debtors in order that they might renew their relationships with their debts. Also relevant here is Davies' research on low-income UK debtors, which highlights how kind of unequal struggles over moral value are present in debtor-creditor relationship, which become expressed through debtors' kind of suspensory strategy to debts, whereby they kind of disengage themselves, cut themselves off from the moral obligations to repay debts, primarily through kind of humor, through jokingly referring to themselves as being bad debtors. And as we'll see later on in this talk, humor also plays a very important role here. So this kind of correlates with Gregory's assertion that although there exists a general cultural sensibility across all human societies that regards debt to be a burden and credit to be liberating, actually moral evaluations of individual creditors or debtors as social actors are in fact often very inconsistent, and they vary over different times in different places. Research as well also points to the growing role played by the media in the formation of these kind of evaluations, moral evaluations of creditors or debtors. Nowadays, we see online communities of debtors have become really important arenas for reflecting on and discussing the moral dimensions of creditor-debtor relations. And there's been studies of this done in places like the UK, US, and so on. So sometimes these even give rise to more organized debt resistance action. These phenomena raise particularly important questions for the case of China and also maybe Asia more generally, where widespread cashlessness has emerged owing to the popularity of smartphone-based digital money platforms, which are often actually embedded directly within social networking platforms. So amongst this almost archetypal instance of what Swartz has called payment as social media, and a broader cultural backdrop where digital money exhibits strongly social propensities, lenders actually have sought to advance the government's program of internet finance by digitizing consumer credit under the guise of and under a program of financial inclusion. This distinctive cultural convergence of cashlessness, consumer credit, and social media, which we see in China, actually raises really important questions regarding the shifting moral terrain of interactions between credit collectors and debtors within a highly mediated digital environment. Okay, so the second section of my talk is now called Pandemic Methodologies. So as mentioned before, this paper emerges from Yi-Chen and my own desire to kind of better understand how the already significant transactions that had been occurring in the field of credit collection in mainland China were being shaped by the unfolding of an unprecedented pandemic that made it impossible to do traditional fieldwork, if there ever was such a thing. So, you know, Yi-Chen and I, like many of us here today, I'm sure, and many anthropologists throughout the world, kind of found ourselves being forced to be like armchair anthropologists and to figure out a way to get at what was going on with credit collection without being able to leave our homes or our offices or our places where we lived. So the investigative approach that we ultimately developed relied on our explorations of rich collections of videos concerning debt collections that are actually shared publicly and publicly posted on the Chinese video streaming platform Xigua Shipin, Xigua Video. So the videos are all shared in early 2020. Now, taken together, these videos point to the existence of a loosely structured online like anti-credit collection alliance that produce and comment on videos motivated really by a common desire for sharing strategies to counter the techniques employed by credit collection industry to recover debts from borrowers who are in arrears. Although this video-centered approach meant that we were unable to directly interact with either debtors or credit collectors, actually the frankness with which these debtors discuss credit collection within these videos nonetheless deliver very rich insights into normal experiences of debt during this period. Okay, so this section of the talk is going to be called Putting Debts into Lockdown. Now, for borrowers who were either already in debt before lockdowns were introduced or who fell behind on their repayments in the weeks following the onset of restrictions in China, it initially appeared as though financial institutions and also debt collection agencies might have in fact pushed the pause button on their debts. Those people who had been used to receiving constant calls from debt collection agencies inquiring about their financial situation or pressuring them to make payments unexpectedly enjoyed a few weeks of relatively undisturbed silence. Now, was the disappearance of human credit collection calls chasing debtors during the lockdown period a sign that these creditors had somehow suddenly developed a sense of compassion for these people who were in debt in the midst of what was officially being branded a people's war against the virus? Any impressions debtors might have had to that effect actually quickly vanished with the partial loosening of lockdown restrictions in early April 2020, as explained by anti-credit collection vlogger Goldze in a self-made video filmed actually from his own bedroom while wearing his pajamas. So Goldzer says in the video, in the last couple of days, a lot of friends have asked me, why has there suddenly been so many of these debt collection telephone calls? Because previously, under the influence of the epidemic, many places had not returned to work, including third-party debt collection agencies. They definitely not referred to work. So in the last couple of days, as the pandemic has receded, what we see is lots of places resuming work, including third-party collection agencies. However, as the nation gradually emerged from this extended lockdown and these credit collectors and nationwide began to resume their pursuit of late payments, a new problem began to emerge on the horizon and coalesce for both debtors and also for credit collectors. And that problem was what might be an appropriate way of actually handling the issue of unpaid debt amidst a continuing, what was being called a continuing battle of annihilation against the virus on the one hand, and also at the same time calls to resume economic output on the other. So this next section is called Business as Unusual, Emerging Moral Ambiguities in Debt Collection. And I want to start this section with another quote. At the moment, in the aid of the country, we are all trying our best to avoid leaving the home in order to stop the spread of the virus. Now, this comment was actually made by a cancer-suffering military veteran called Wonger at the start of his vlog. And it actually helped to frame the instructional guidance that he was preparing to give his vlog audience on how to lodge complaints with WeBank customer service agents in order that they should cease making automated debt collection calls. The same statement also attempted to make a very important moral claim that if staying at home meant sacrificing one's earnings and missing loan repayments in order to make a positive contribution to the national effort against the virus, then certainly this was a very laudable and positive course of action. So credit collectors now found themselves having to grapple with debtors' claims that their inability to repay had somehow stemmed from their collectively minded attempts to act in the national interest in a moment of crisis by following instructions to remain in their hometown, or not working because factory employers had temporarily closed factories on the order of kind of local governments. And these reasons actually could powerfully counteract any aspersions that might be cast by credit collectors that debtors somehow might be unwilling to repay their debts, or maybe simply they were lazy or work shy. Furthermore, these reasons also constituted a very powerful new line of moral reasoning, which sharply curtailed the kinds of pressure that it was possible for credit collectors to apply to debtors. So it's important, really important to note in this context that many of the ambiguities regarding credit collection practices in China actually existed before the outbreak of COVID-19. Even prior to the epidemic, the government and financial regulators had been making concerted attempts to try to civilize the credit collection industry. Multiple high-profile usury cases had led the government to constantly strengthen regulation over the industry in order to eliminate improper practices. Successive regulations have said there was not going to be any usury above a government-mandated interest red line, no use of violent debt collection methods, or no violation of debtors' privacy. And while these various guidelines and ordinances had effectively curtailed many of the most exploitative debt collection practices, the proliferation of these online loan and peer-to-peer lending platforms from the middle of the last decade onward also had increased the availability of formal credit, especially for individuals and low-income groups who are maybe underserved by traditional banks. So this actually resulted in ever greater numbers of borrowers being drawn into the formal credit collection process. It's therefore very important to note that it's not the case that the moral dilemmas surrounding debt somehow spontaneously coalesced as a result of the epidemic, but rather that the epidemic instead increased the moral ambiguities surrounding what might constitute reasonable debt collection measures. Furthermore, a very, very important third party who was actually present in the debtor-creditor game was actually the state. Even though the government often tended to kind of unwittingly add further ambiguity to the situation due to the way that it published guidelines that were often somewhat vague in their nature. So this next section is kind of called grasping at the state. So during the peak time of the pandemic, the guidelines issued by the state mandated only that for those individuals affected by COVID-19, for example, because of illness, because of quarantine, undertaking essential sport work, or temporary loss of earnings, actually financial institutions ought to properly direct, flexibly adjust, properly direct and flexibly adjust arrangements of home mortgage, credit card, and personal loan repayment schedules, along with rationally postponing payment deadlines. Now, the ambiguity in the phrasing of this directive actually provided plenty of scope for differing interpretations at the local level by financial institutions. And of further note is the fact that this directive did not actually apply to microloan agencies that operated online, which instead usually fell under the supervision of the financial officers of local governments. So the ambiguity here that was already present in the guidelines was arguably kind of further intensified owing to the fact that debtors themselves often received information about government policy not by directly reading the policies like this policy from official government sources, but rather they got this information second-hand, usually through user-generated messages and kind of viral messages that were shared on various social media and online message boards. And these kind of messages often distilled this ambiguous regulatory text into much more pertinent everyday registers of language. Now, this kind of information sharing is really notable in that rather than focusing upon the specifics of government-issued guidelines, debtors actually often instead adopted a strategy of kind of invoking vague government policies in their interactions with credit collection callers, even going so far sometimes as to ask to use the calls as an opportunity to actually quiz the credit collectors on whether such policies existed and what they actually were. So this is an example of some of the questions debtors would ask credit collection callers on these kind of calls, asking them if there are these policies or not. However, it wasn't only debtors who appeared to be engaged in these efforts to kind of grasp at state regulation. Credit collection callers and the customer service agents of banks also often referenced regulations in an attempt to defend themselves from debtors' excuses. In another video, the debtor asks the credit collector, why is it that banks can help me extend the deadline, but you guys can't? So he's talking about an online loan in this case. And the credit collector on the other end of the phone gets really angry and says, look, the banks can do it because they're regulated by the state. But I'll tell you, the state's not ordering us to do this, but only suggesting that we might extend the deadline. So although here the state somehow appears to float above these negotiations between the debtor and the creditor, both parties can only really invoke it by referring to vaguely worded government-issued guidelines, a situation which actually creates extra room that ends up being created for the shifting of responsibilities. So this also raises a much deeper question regarding who is ultimately being thought of as the creditor within these interactions. Is it really the companies who are offering loans and credit card companies, along with those third-party credit collection agencies who often pursue the debts on their behalf? Or is it the large banks who often lend money to online loan companies in order that they can engage in such lending in the first place? Or is it the state which lends money to such banks, many of which happen to be state-owned enterprises? Okay, so the next section is called Invoking Friends and Family. And so far, we've primarily discussed the moral obligations that are occurring between credit collection callers and debtors, with the state somehow kind of being invoked within these interactions in a way that generally gives rise to further moral ambiguity and confusion. However, another party that is frequently entangled in the context of such debt relations is actually the family and the friends of debtors themselves. And it's often actually the credit collection agencies who initially invoke somehow the spectre, the figure of family and friends during these calls, often actually as part of a strategy that aims to take advantage of a widespread cultural sensibility that exists in China that regards debt chiefly as chiefly being a kind of household or even sometimes a community affair rather than a purely individual matter, despite the fact that this, in the legal sense, debt often is very clearly an individual kind of matter. So the COVID-19 outbreak in particular gave this particular credit collection strategy additional importance because many credit collection callers seemed to actually be aware that debtors were likely to be back in their hometowns where they were stuck and they couldn't return to work. And they were also, in fact, surrounded by extended networks of family and friends there. So this invoking of family or friends speaks to the fact that in the Chinese cultural context, most private debt relationships tend to be drawn within a broader sphere of family responsibilities. If you can't return your debt, then it's your family who traditionally would have lived in the same village or community as you, who would be felt to be responsible for repaying it. However, of course, as we all know, the forces of rapid marketization, urbanization, financialization, and digitalization that have swept across China in recent decades have led people's debts to become increasingly decontextualized from traditional family moral obligations. One's family members nowadays are typically not actually directly legally responsible for his or her debts, unless, of course, they've officially acted as the guarantor in loan agreements or that they've borrowed collectively, as you might see in the case of a married couple, for example, who take out a loan together. In fact, actually, it's not unusual, and I think this is really telling that it's not unusual for banks to often specifically ask the family of, say, entrepreneurs who may apply for sizable, really big loans. In these situations, it's not unusual for them to ask family to act as legal guarantors in the loan contracts. However, for the majority of small personal credit products, things like credit cards, online loans, and so on, family or friends would seldom bear any legal liability. Indeed, actually, it's precisely this depersonalized quality of many of the novel forms of digital credit in China. It's precisely this depersonalized nature that actually attracts younger people to take out these credit products because they're keen to avoid potentially burdensome emotional obligations that might come from borrowing from friends or family. And both Yi Chen and I have papers where we've written about these things things separately. Many financial institutions therefore intentionally employ a strategy of trying to depersonalize and decontextualize their credit products in an attempt to attract borrowers. However, when borrowers subsequently become defaulters, credit collection callers then often try to invoke the presence of debtors' family and friends within the debt relationship with the intention of inducing a moral pressure capable of eliciting repayments from debtors. So I'm going to show you a quick video to demonstrate this.
喂，崔先生吗？你在我们平台欠款已经严重逾期了啊！你如果再不还款，我们要采取手段了。
我不是不想还啊，我手里真没有啊。
没有你去借去啊！你在我这哭穷有什么用啊？
问谁借呀？现在谁还能借我呀？
问你亲头借呗。
亲戚朋友，我现在还有什么亲戚朋友啊？你们上次报我通讯录都知道我欠款了，现在还让我去管他们借，谁能借我呀？
我告诉你啊，我不管你这些，你要是今天下午4点之前还不还款，我们就要采取手段了啊！
外币你们收不？要收你们把地址给我，晚上我给你们整过去。
是区的外币哪儿的？
天地银行的。我是崔教授，关注我，每晚8点直播间为大家讲解负债、逾期、催收相关知识。
Okay, so in this wonderful video from Professor Cui, don't know if he's a real professor or not, you can see that actually it shows a really common collection strategy, which often relies on a practice which is nicknamed blowing or bao, right? To blow one's contacts, whereby during the credit collection application process, borrowers will often unwittingly grant lenders access to the contact lists that are actually stored in their smartphone and give them permission to make calls to these contacts should debtors fall into arrears. Therefore, there's many debtors who respond to callers' suggestions that they should borrow from family or friends by countering, like Professor Cui says, I no longer have any friends because you guys blow my my phone contacts. So the invoking of family and friend relations in the context of these moral negotiations is, we believe, really significant because this action actually implicitly recognizes that creditors understand that these debts actually do occur within the context of debtors' broader social relations. Credit collection callers' actions, in fact, appear to kind of tacitly acknowledge that debtors are in fact much more than account numbers or outstanding balances. They're individuals who are embedded in families and communities who are sensitive to moral relations and to the opinions of others, which may be shaped by their own moral standing and their ability to repay debts. So this behavior really brings us to consider Graeber's assertion that to make something saleable in a human economy, you first of all need to rip it from its context. This is really relevant as the debtors who we see in our videos, the majority of whom appear to be kind of migrant workers, seem to be facing two forms of decontextualization, or we might call deterritorialization. First, these workers are often severed from their places of origin and their dense networks of family connections when they migrate to cities to engage in strenuous wage labor. Second, they're also torn from their social obligations when they sign up for digital credit products, for online loans, and they become indebted to platforms that seem to only ever want to talk money with them. And indeed, as I said, this is part of the appeal of these products in the very first place. But when borrowers fall into arrears and banks and online platforms suddenly want their money returned, these institutions suddenly try to recontextualize these borrowers, seeing them not merely as an objectified credit profile or an outstanding account, but instead as somebody who's ensconced and embedded in networks of social and emotional connections with family and friends. This collection method, therefore, gained additional importance during the pandemic, owing to the coincidence that many borrowers had indeed just returned to their hometown and again found themselves strongly embedded in familiar kinship and friendship networks. In contrast, Graeber's description of feudal debts, in contrast to Graeber's description of feudal debts and debtors' prisons that saw creditors violently, enslave debtors with the promise that if the debtors could repay the money that they owed, they'd be freed and able to return to their family. In our own study, in our case, the logic instead becomes one where it says, you need to repay the money by going back to your family. So I want to give another example of this in this second short video.
资产管理中心的给你来电是关于你本人的贷款逾期的案子，你这边有印象吗？
欠今天的钱，对，没错。
哎，那么目前的话，内容是怀疑您本人存在一个恶意拖欠的嫌疑，是要求我方将证据材料整理完毕后，将您本人的案件委托至律师事务所，对您本人使用简易的司法诉讼流程来处理。那么这边来电的话有2个目的，首先第一是了解一下您逾期的一个真实原因。第二是告知到你目前的案情进展以及后期你这边所需要承担的法律责任。那么想问一下黄先生，你这边在欠款逾期高达33天以上是什么原因呢？您那边现在还没有复工吗？
复工了，但是又被裁掉了。对，现在还在找工作。
你也知道啊，黄先生。
你也知道了，你是武汉人吗？
是啊。
哦，那也是，这个疫情大家也不容易，你也知道啊，你在当地也亲身经历过了。我虽然在外地的话，也经历的也不少。上个月应该是月初吧，应该是4月月初回到广州。不是有那个3月白园区不是要很多那个什么黑人那个疫情的吗？上了不久就被裁掉了，又隔了10几天，顶不住了。
您是说您现在已经没有工作是吧？
没有了。
哦，那是这样子，那您的意思就是说您现在是没有工作，导致您的资金周转不开，所以才没有还这个欠款，对吗？
之前你们也给我来个电话，我都说好了吧，希望你们我这块我可能也需要一段时间的，需要时间来处理，毕竟金条欠的也不多，说不定我可能过1-2个月，说不定到时候我找到工作的话，说不定一次性还清也说不定的。
是这样子的，黄先生，我方现在给您来电的话，就不是您还不还钱的问题了，追究您这个合同违约的一个法律责任。那么您的意思就是说，您是想直接默认走这个司法流程来处理，对吗？
反正我的意思就是说，我需要时间，起码好几个月，我上班了，我才有钱，然后就还这笔账啊。
那好的，那您这边的话，那我就直接把你这个案件材料直接给您封档，下发至第三方律所。那您现在是在您这个广东省清远市吗？
我现在在白云区，在三元里，白云区3元里那边。
那您这边最好是这2天回家，因为这2天会有相应的那个律师函、通告函会下发到您户籍地，然后需要您本人持身份证原件去签收的。
身份证原件？
对，需要您本人持身份证原件去您家里签收，然后如果说我们一旦你这个案件如果说一旦是由律师事务所向法院申请立案成功的话，那么您的个人征信将纳入全国失信人员黑名单行列，在7年以内是不得以任何形式进行恢复的，免得你到时候回不了家，坐不了高铁，坐不了飞机，你明白我的意思吧？
知道。
到时候您缺庭审判呐什么的，到时候要追究您更严重的一个法律责任，您理解我的意思吧？理解。然后这几天也会有相关的人员去您家里调查取证的，您这个事情跟您家人说过吗？
没有啊。你要去好，没关系啊，到时候如果你看看明天还是后天，如果你们要上门的话，告诉我一声，我也赶得及回来啊，没关系啊。
您这2天的话，这个手机就保持畅通，好吧？会有相关的工作人员跟您联系的，好不好？
对了，还有啊，你们就上次，请问你电话是多少啊？到时候我要保持跟你联系啊，我看看你们要带几个人过来，我在家里准备好啊。
您到时候保持手机畅通就行了，好吧？
但是万一你来陌生人，我万一被骗怎么办啊？我要知道你工号，然后到时候我打你这个电话，我跟你联系，然后就确认一下你们来几个人，我才好招待他们嘛，对不对？
我是只负责收集材料的，到时候会有相关的工作人员去你家里，不是我去，我怎么可能从武汉跑到你广东去呢？
我知道啊，你不可能，他过来我就说他是京东的人嘛。 我也跟你联系好。
打电话联系的好不好？
我可以打电话跟你联系确认啊。
打电系，
你
给我打电话有什么用呢？我把你的材料下发到3方律所去之后，你跟我联系有什么用呢？
我还打电话跟你确认他们来几个人，你跟你确认啦。
你跟我
他们是骗你怎么办啊？
我说了会有相关的工作人员跟你联系的呀。
他不是你们催收同事吗？
你畅通就行了。
他不是你们同事吗？
我们不是一个部门的，我认识那么多人。
哦，那么多人啊。对啊，还有啊，你们之前报我通讯录，这件事情这个案子怎么处理啊？你们都没有跟我道歉。你们要先跟我道歉哦。
我是不知道，你不用跟我说啊，您不用跟我说。
我不管你
这个
都是你们第三方的人了，我哪管你那么多啊？你们必须要跟我道完歉才行哦。
反正希望您和您的家人到时候配合相关的工作，承担相应的法律责任就行了。
你们来几个人？你们说好来几个人了，我好招待啊。
Okay, so to conclude, the conclusion is called the shifting imaginary of collective responsibility. So we believe that the resort to the recontextualization or the repersonalization by the credit collection agents witnessed in these calls actually serves as an attempt to collect debts more efficiently by applying certain kinds of moral pressures on debtors. However, such actors also end up reminding the debtors of the increasingly sharp divergences between formal debt and other moral obligations in society. Debtors now come to understand that in order to morally justify not repaying their debts, they themselves must advocate for debt to somehow be kept in a depersonalized state, as it had originally been. The irony of this state of affairs is often not lost on debtors, who themselves are keenly aware of the self-contradictory behaviors of credit collection callers, given the impossibility of their instructions to debtors that they should recontextualize their debts in relation to their own family and friends, despite these very same relations, as we just saw in this video, having been destroyed by collectors' own attempts to contact these persons in the first place. Now, debtors also often find collectors' threats to be fictional. For instance, in this video where the credit collection caller told the debtor, I'll send people to your village to give you the legal documents, you see, the debtor actually quite funnily and sardonically responding, oh, please do come. I'll treat you really well. I'll be a good host, knowing full well that the outsourced call center-based debt collectors are actually, in fact, very highly unlikely to travel to some distant village in the middle of an unprecedented pandemic. Debtors, on their part, held an attitude towards collection agents which asserted that if debtors were really supposed to feel a human emotion of shame, then actually the credit collectors should, at the very least, also act like humans who are capable of affording others the necessary sympathy and moral reasoning, rather than behaving somewhat like a machine that's pre-programmed to mechanically check facts and harass debtors from a position of distrust. So this prompts us to actually consider how these platforms actively, how online lending platforms actively decontextualize individuals into data points of credits and risk, while also at the same time recontextualizing them into social relations at the moments when debts need to be collected. Because individuals can never understand the context in its moral entirety as it's destroyed by these financial machines, they instead encounter this through a set of struggles beyond the moral contours of debt surrounding community relations. First, as debtors can't directly negotiate their debt with the lenders, but instead encounter outsourced third-party debt collectors who typically rely on these formulaic scripts in their interactions. Debtors attempt to enact political struggles by breaking out of these scripts. Second, as debtors are unable to call upon clear legislation to justify their delays or to to defend their rights. They instead turned to loosely organize in these highly mediated anti-credit collection community in order to share tips with each other on how to invoke the state and COVID-19 discourses in the interactions with their collectors. Third, as these debtors have been temporarily deprived of their urban jobs and dispersed in their hometowns across the nation, debtors react hypocritically to the symbolic threats implicit in the vague recontextualization efforts that are made by debt collectors. So therefore, to conclude, we argue here that what the anti-debt collection videos suggest, what they seem to show, is that debtors' own attempts of recontextualizing their debt, which actually differ markedly from the ways that the institutions want these debts to be recontextualized. These resources, the resources that are drawn in their self-contextualization of debts include the symbolic power of the state and public legal commitment as a kind of broader imaginary of a more powerful collective responsibility that should exist under the pandemic. And this is weighed against the imaginary of family and private moral commitment as being this narrow binding force that is enforced by these debt collectors. So I'll close there and thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Tom. It's super interesting. I have a lot of questions myself, but I'll first see if anyone on the floor wants to ask their questions, or I'll give them a few minutes and I'll start with myself. So thank you so much. I really enjoy the talk. It's very interesting and the videos are super entertaining. So where do I start? I'll start with the ethnography. Can you tell us a little bit more about the callers? Are they the same group of people because of COVID, and then they the way they ask people to repay the debt is by calling them. So are these callers in the debt collectors in the same debt collectors in the call center, the same group of people who would normally go out to, I don't know, knock on people's doors? Are they the same group of people? And a related question is, can you talk a little bit about the professionalization of debt collectors? Because from the video, it seems like they have, a script to read out, and they seem to know what's the next, like whether to send your case to the lawyers or. But then what I find most intriguing is that they have this like professionalized script to read out, seems to have a procedure, but then they are also quite flexible, and then they suddenly ask you about, so have you lost your job recently? Are you made redundant? Why don't you ask your family? So that sudden shift between I'm a professional debt collector to suddenly, start to need to inquire you about some quite personal stuff. I find those conversations like really interesting. Is that you're supposed to call and maintain a professional conversation, and then it just suddenly gets quite personal. And I guess I'll wrap up with the final question is, do you know, or can you tell us a little bit more about how do they collect debt before COVID? So in the first video, the lady said, well, if you don't pay us back, we'll take the next measure. So what are those measures? I'll give us more ethnography. I would like to hear more. It's fascinating.
Great. Thank you so much for the wonderful questions, Loretta. Yeah. So, I mean, to start with your first question about who are they? Are these people? Hello.
Sorry. Can I just interrupt? Would you mind? Would you mind stop sharing the screen so that we can see?
I'm so sorry.
No, it's okay. It's okay. I think.
There you go.
Great. Sorry to interrupt you.
Great. So a couple of brilliant questions. So the first one, like, who are they? I think that you raised the point, are these the same burly gentlemen, who might have previously been sent to your house, before you might have Ibanrin, this big like group of guys who are sent to your house. I mean, of course, it's difficult to tell who is on the end of the line. And all Echan and I, well, I mean, Echan's done more research in the debt collection industry and through his P2P work. But I mean, from looking at the videos, you know, all we have often are the voices, because you know, these videos are all made by debtors who record the calls and then post them online. So we're seeing as much as the debtors are seeing, generally speaking. However, you know, one would imagine that the people who may have previously been sent to your house to possess a very different skill set from people who would be working in a call center, carrying out this kind of emotional labor, if you like, of pursuing these kind of calls. So this is, I mean, the answer is a little bit speculative, but also another ethnographic detail, if you like, that got missed out of this shortened talk from the paper is the paper, and one that's probably much more of interest to the audience of this talk, is that actually these calls are often paired with automated techniques. So these same debtors are often deluged with messages, SMS messages, telling them about their debts, telling them how much they're overdue, and when they have to pay. The calls, they also get robocalls often, which are pre-recorded, or, you know, computer voice calls that will tell them this. And even, you know, some of the calls are often in a queue. So some of the videos we watch, you know, debtors are saying, I get a call and it's a human call, but it's the same time every day. It's always at 3:30 p.m. like every single day. So they're obviously on a queue and a schedule, and they go through the system. So there's all kinds of machines and technologies kind of behind that stuff. So I hope that kind of partially answers the who are they. And another point in that, another detail, is that it's quite interesting because these callers, you know, maybe are kind of more white collar workers, right? So there are differences in when you watch quite a lot of these videos, you realize that, you know, a lot of our debtors are maybe still like rural migrants and people like that. So there are, you know, kind of differences in class, if you like, between these kinds of groups, right? So hopefully that answers the first bit. And yeah, the shift between the personal and the professional is, I mean, thank you for the comment, because I think maybe our paper in its current form emphasizes the professional a lot, because I suppose we're emphasizing it as a contrast to those Baoli Caishou, the violent debt collection techniques that used to take place. So the industry has professionalized, but that doesn't mean that everything is this formulaic, entirely a formulaic script. So yeah, I mean, I completely take your point that there is a lot of going off the script. There's a lot of trying to empathize and negotiate with people. It does make me think of Joe Devill's work that I mentioned before, who's worked on debt collectors. And he has this, you know, one of the really nice things he talks about when he talks about this idea of captation is the idea that actually debt collectors always, you know, they'll try 20 different techniques because they know one technique will work on one person, but another technique will work on someone else, and they just don't know. So they have to keep trying things, you know, and so on. And just to go back to your kind of final point about what comes next. If they're not sending a group of people around to your house, what comes next? Well, you know, as the final video kind of suggested, not much. You know, all that can come next is that they send you a letter, you know, and then another letter, you know, and they'll send you a letter by shunfeng or whatever, and it, you know, try and make it look like it's a legal letter from you know, an institution or something. So you know, at the end of the day, there's still not kind of personal bankruptcy in China, right? So, you know, the worst that will happen is people will get put on blacklists, you know, as the video kind of suggested. So yeah, you know, some of the videos we watch, debtors are very aware of this. You know, and they are, you know, you know, a few debtors say just don't bother paying back at all. You know, eventually they'll give up. So you know, that's not everybody, but you know, there are different things. But yeah, the professionalization of this industry, I think, has led to you know, you know, more and more of these different techniques being tried, and the process, if you like, of collections being drawn out longer and longer.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I actually really like the emphasis on the professionalization, because so before you gave this talk, last year I watched this. Sorry, is there anyone else who want to ask a question? I don't want to dominate the floor, but I do want to like continue a conversation. Someone asked a question, so I'll give that person the opportunity and maybe we can go back to the conversation. But yes, thank you so much for giving more context. So Chu Yang Water, okay. Chu Yang asks, I'm wondering if there are any gender dimensions. I'm wondering if there's any gender dimensions in debt collections. Do most debt collection callers, are they mostly women? And do people who upload their audio calls on video platform men? Okay.
Yeah, Trey Young, thank you so much. Great question. From the videos we watched, I believe that you're probably not far wrong. I think you're probably your guess is quite right. Well, at least on the view of debtors, right? So I think Yichen can correct me if you're wrong, but Yichen found a really interesting report recently that said, I think 68% of borrowers on P2P platforms, for example, are males. Certainly our own, of the videos we watched, you know, we had a spreadsheet and we went through the videos. Almost all videos are posted by male debtors. So I think this anti-credit collection alliance, if you like, these people who are active posting online are predominantly males. In terms of callers, actually, I think it's a bit of a mix. Certainly, we heard female callers like the one we heard the two we heard in the videos, but there were also plenty of male credit collection callers on our videos as well. So it didn't seem that you know, it doesn't seem that the industry has a preference towards one or the other in terms of callers. Or at least we didn't get that impression from listening to the calls.
Great.
Just a quick add to perhaps Loretta's question on staying professional. So we actually had a lot of videos that we didn't show that are made by people who are who lost their temper. And then shouting to each other, like swearing. And this is often kind of regulated through a third party who received reportings from debtors who report this violent debt, kind of quote unquote violent debt collection calls with swearing words. And then sometimes, you know, the debt collection agency would suffer from this kind of reportings. So that is also the reason why people would rather read through a script so that they stay safe from being charged. And that's why nowadays many debt collection agencies are considering applying things like AI to replace the debt collectors, because AIs are more kind of stable and civilized in a sense.
AI is not going to lose its temper.
Yeah.
Yeah, I find the professionalization of debtors, like that part, really fascinating, because growing up watching these movies, and you know, they were all very violent and mostly men. But last year I watched this Chinese drama, like TV drama. It's a story about a girl in Shanghai who was a sales, but then, you know, there's something happened in her life, and then she became a debt collector, and she worked in this, like, in a really nice office in the financial district of Shanghai, and everything is very professional. And she has to study all the finance literacy stuff before she was being sent out. And then she during the debt collection, she also, one time there was this story that she empathized with the person, like the debtors, and then but actually got, you know, her money got cheated by the person, because she actually lent out her own money from her own pockets, because the person said, oh, my family don't have food to eat, things like that. So I just find it really fascinating that this constant switching between the personal, being the empathize, you know, I'm also a human being, I also understand that you're being laid off and stuff like that, but then also at the same time maintaining this professionalized aspect of it. So just a comment. And there's another question from Alex Chow from the CBFL at NUS. He says, thanks very much for the excellent presentation. I'm wondering where the debt collection happened, and is it possible that the debt collection callers may behave differently or similarly in China? I don't know where you are comparing with. Is it Singapore? Maybe you can clarify in a next message. And the second question is, I'm wondering if the influence of the overall phone online scams. So I guess he's asking if, you know, there are scam calls. I think I've also received those phone calls, and how people distinguish, like, if it's like a legit thing. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's, you know, okay, so thank you, Alex, for the great questions. The first one, I'm wondering where the debt collection happens. I'm also, oh yeah, so this follows on. Is it possible that debt collection callers may behave differently or similarly in China? Well, so of course, you know, with in questions of where it happens, well, I suppose, you know, the obviously this talk has emphasized that the collection, if you like, is now largely mediated, right? So it's no longer is it happening in person, no longer is it happening with people coming to your house. I think that's what you're getting at. But another way to kind of reconsider that actually is also, because of that mediated nature of it, this is also a kind of despatialized. We spoke a little bit in the talk about deterritorialization. It's also a despatialized interaction. So actually, nowadays, what you see is, you know, that actually, you know, you may be borrowing from Ant Credit Pay, and we know they're based in Hangzhou, but maybe actually their callers are based in another, the credit collection agency may be based in another city in China, you know, and maybe, you know, their borrowers are all over the country, right? So this is certainly a national and a nationwide pursuit right now. And I think that adds an extra quality to it. So we saw that, we saw that in the final video where the guy is jokingly saying, oh yeah, please come to my house. I'll put a cup of tea on for you and wait for you to come around, right? So there is this knowledge and an awareness that things are detached. And also, there's all these efforts to go back to the point Loretta made, there's all these efforts and ideals and expectations that actually companies and people should know where they are. People saying, do you not know from looking at my area code, which city I'm from, and things like that. So I think that, I don't know if that quite answers your question. Yeah, if I'm not answering it correctly, maybe you can clarify a little. For phone calls and online scams, well, yeah, I mean, I think again, those videos kind of show the processes of verification, but also these can be, again, it's like another strategy that the debtors will use against the credit collectors. Oh, tell me your staff number. Tell me, they'll say to the callers, well, I need to know that you're real. So, can you tell me your staff number? And of course, callers may not be happy to do that because it opens them up to a greater likelihood of the kinds of complaints that Ichan was talking about there. So I think it's a double-edged sword, right? Of course, there is this concern about being scammed, but this is also a great way of defending yourself against even legitimate credit collection callers, because you can say, oh, well, how do I know you're actually real? I mean, I think Ichan and I, although this, debt is quite a morbid and sad topic sometimes, actually, Ichan and I have always found watching these videos, fascinating because of how inventive both debtors and credit collection callers are, and how imaginative they are in the ways that they handle these situations, and try to advance their moral positions. I think that's really, really important. So I hope that answers your thing. I don't know if you have anything to add there, Ichan, at all.
Yeah, it's just one empirical fact that many people receive the calls, and many of the calls are tagged as harassment calls, and that's one aspect of the technology that are kind of enabling the debtors as well. You could record the calls, you could tag the calls, so that you see other people tagging the calls with scams, with harassment, with things like that. So I think that's one interesting fact.
So Alex and Qiuyang, do you have any response or follow-up questions, or anyone else who would like to ask the questions? We have about 15 minutes. Okay, then I'll ask the follow-up questions. So just now,
I think Gonzalo has a question.
Yeah. I mean, if you want to follow up, Loretta, feel free. We still have 15 minutes.
No, I shouldn't dominate the floor anymore.
Okay. Yeah, I have a couple of questions. Well, first of all, thank you. I really enjoyed it. Very rich, especially the micro materials. It's really fascinating. At some points it looked like we were in a linguistic anthropology sort of session. And you were sharing some transcripts, some fascinating transcripts on code switching practices, right? But actually, my question has little to do with this sort of micro level code switching practice, and it has more to do with the sort of collective imaginary that you were talking about in the beginning and also towards the end. And it's sort of a clarifying question you know, partly because I don't know much about the subject, and also because I think it's probably an important issue to clarify, given the argument that you are making about the linkages between the ambiguities in collective imaginaries and you know the shifting practices that are taking place, or the shifting interactions, moral interactions between debtors and debt collecting agencies. I'm sort of, you know, I wonder if you could elaborate a little bit more about the state's position on, you know, on loan repayments. I mean, I'm asking this because, you know, being at the moment based in Europe, probably it's one of the biggest things in the news almost every day is moratorias on loan repayments. That was the major issue in the European Union regarding, you know, what to do with the crisis of this pandemic and the impact of mass lockdowns. And in your presentation, you sort of talked about, you know, how the state has been, even before the pandemic, trying to kind of promote civilizing campaigns of, you know, credit collecting agencies and, the, you know, debt collecting agencies. You talked about, you know, the imposition of government mandated credit lines, regulations for improper conduct. And I kind of, you know, I wonder what was sort of the, you know, if you could describe the position of the state, you know, post-pandemic, post-enforcement of lockdown, what was the, you know, the official position of the state on loan repayments? You know, will there be a generalized moratoria on loan repayments that, you know, affects not just loans made with banking institutions, but also sort of private credit collecting institutions? Were there any major statements? Were there any major laws issued on this issue? I think this is sort of important to kind of understand the sort of collective imaginary that you are talking about. Then I have another question, but you can, if you want, you can just go ahead and answer this one.
No, why don't we you ask them both, because maybe they'll link to each other nicely.
Okay.
I'm hoping.
Okay. Yeah, the second one is a bit dark, and you know, and it has to do with the fact that, you know, you recently heard the story from someone I know relatively well in the countryside, you know, about, you know, a young boy that I met when he was like 5 years old. He you know, he's now like 20. Well, he was 20, 25, and he committed suicide. He committed suicide, and you know, sort of I suppose it's a person that fits in the kind of profile of debtors that you are talking about. So sort of a rural migrant, you know, young, sort of borrowing money on a sort of individual level without the family sort of knowing. So falling prey of the kinds of strategies of depersonalization that you were describing in the paper, right? And of course, you know, he accumulated debt to a level that was, you know, beyond manageable, and he ended up committing suicide. And of course, I mean, this is a tragedy. I imagine that under conditions of mass lockdown in the country the size of China, there must be hundreds, thousands of stories like this one. So I kind of wonder whether this kind of more dark side of debt has emerged somehow in your research in the internet about this, you know, about what's going on since the pandemic began. Okay, so two questions. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Second one a bit dark, sorry.
That's okay. That's okay. So I mean, I think the collective imaginary, you know, I think you are bang on the money, if you don't mind the expression. It's an appropriate expression for this topic. You know, and when we set out and began to do this research, I mean, you know, I was constantly saying exactly the same thing to Yichen. I was like, it's absolutely incredible what's happening in Europe at the moment, you know, because literally, you know, the pause button is hit, all debts are in the deep freeze, and, you know, kind of blank checks are being written. So I think that you know, I feel that you know, each one will have a much clearer idea of the regulations than me, but my understanding is that like the kind of regulation that we put up on the screen there, is that actually you know, there was no such explicit order to kind of pause debts, or you know, pause interest on debts, and instead there's this kind of expectation on the one hand that debts will continue, but on the other hand that banks, lenders should be reasonable, you know, whatever that means. You know, and the other thing that popped into my head when you spoke about the collective imaginary is, I think actually we have to go back even. I think you know, in China the state always has an ambiguous relationship with debt, because you know, you know, you know, you know, debt in a kind of socialist economy is a kind of, in and of itself, is a kind of troubling moral thing, right? So I mean, that's an extra point, if you like, and an extra context. So, you know, way back in the Maoist era, you know, the state was the you know, sole issuer of debt, you know, and obviously now we've seen this, you know, with P2P lending, and even before that, you know, from the 80s and 90s, we've seen, you know, an increase in all kinds of, in banks, and now all kinds of other organizations offering loans and credit products. So yeah, you know, I think when we're thinking about that collective imaginary, I do think it's also worthwhile to even to think about, you know, the bigger context of debt in a kind of you know, economy with Chinese characteristics, you know. So sorry, so I don't know if I answered that quite well. Would you like to add anything on that, Yichen?
Yeah, just one quick update, because it really depends on what state is meant here. So you know, for example, the central bank represents the state to some extent, but on the other hand, the Supreme Court is also the very key actor in this kind of private debt relationship, because, you know, they are the people who kind of define what is the legally protected interest rate in the private loans. And right now, they are actually lowering down this kind of private loan interest rate to, I think it's only 15%, which is much lower than before. Much lower is like 24 to 36%. So it means that if you have signed a contract that is above 15% interest rate loan, and that contract is no longer valid. So that actually makes a huge challenge to the kind of micro loan agencies and these debt collection agencies, because that means they have to renegotiate the interest rates for many times with the debtors, and that actually makes the debtors we're talking about here kind of with more weapons to use when they are dealing with these debt collection callers.
Okay, so we only have 10 minutes left. So as the moderator, I have to make some decision, you know, how to proceed. So I will.
There's also the suicide question. Sorry.
Yeah, I think we have another question.
But please keep it brief, Tom.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, I mean, actually, although, you know, we never saw anything as tragic as the example that you shared, in many of these videos, they're tinged with, you know, a bit of hopelessness, you know, or at least I felt that watching them. One thing that didn't come through in the videos that we shared is that many of these debtors have multiple debts with multiple borrowers, often, you know, P2P, online, and credit pay, credit cards rolled into one. You know, you feel like that often they meet one repayment, you know, and by the time they've met one, you know, the next one is due. Oh, sorry, by the time they've caught up with one, the next one's already due. So definitely, you know, there is a feeling, I think, with that. But you know, and also I suppose that's why this, like, community of people, these sharing videos, actually give people some hope. They let people see other people who are in the similar situation, you know, and make them feel at least that something can be done, right? So I suppose part of this is that people, you know, when you're calling somebody and you have them on the phone, you're grabbing someone out of wherever they are. And it can be very lonely, even if you're surrounded by your family, to be on the phone with somebody asking these questions. So I suppose the other side is that this community gives them somewhere to share that. So I hope that answers a little bit as fast as I can. Sorry. Okay, so we have 5 minutes. I think you've already, in your response to Gonzalo just now, kind of answered Xin Long's question. He or she asked what makes the debtors put the videos online. So I think you've just answered that. And then Phoebe has a questions about, she's curious if the people nowadays also prepare themselves to deal with the callers when they borrow money. So in other words, do the debtors also professionalize us, just like the industry? And Chow has, there are many tragic examples, as you can easily find them in the news, probably reflects critical methodological failure. Wow. I love the critique. I love the critique. Wow, that's quite a long questions from long. Would you like to respond as I read it, yeah, and then maybe short? Yeah, so I'll take a few. I mean, you know, do debtors professionalize? So I don't know. Are any of these people offering courses or anything more than this, Yi-Chen? Are they?
I'm sorry?
Are any debtors offering things like courses on how to,
yeah,
or selling their skills? Yeah.
Of course, because we're talking about here is not just debtors. We're talking about anti-debt collection alliance people. So it's like this group of people are kind of mutual support groups online at, you know, various platforms. And then Xigua is one of the platforms. And then some of them, of course, offer kind of coaching services or even courses to teach people how to build up themselves. And I think responding to the tragic stories, I think maybe some of the tragic stories are saved through this kind of mutual support as well, because this is very key to not only kind of professionally or knowledge based, but also kind of emotionally, you know, because we find a community and a sense of belongingness there.
Alex had a follow-on point saying that maybe creditors ignore the callers sometimes and just let the court make decisions. I think that's very fair. I think often there'll be a point where, and of course these agencies will get money if they successfully get money off people, right? So there'll be a point where they drop callers and send it to the next place. So I think that's very true. To answer Charles' question, I mean, we were interested in this anti-credit collection alliance. That's what when we look at the videos we looked at, that's what it points to. So we work with the examples that we have rather than seeking out specific examples particularly. But thank you very much for the great point. Nicholas says, I
can maybe read it out very quickly.
Yeah.
So people are not looking at the screen. So Nicholas says, thanks very much for the wonderful presentation. I'm researching consumer credits and digital lending in Vietnam, where debt collection industry is emerging. And the industry is shrouded in controversy because it's presumed links with criminal world, in particular the black credits, gangs, and money lenders. I wonder if China's debt collection industry is somehow connected to the underworld as well, or with the illegal credits and collection firms. And in Vietnam, there are also Facebook groups run by borrowers that antagonize predatory digital lending apps. As opposed to China, these groups are private and the managers double-check new members to deter real disappointed borrowers and angry creditors and debt collectors. Aren't Chinese debtors afraid of being identified or tracked? And thanks so much for the wonderful research. So I think people don't mind you going a bit over time if you So go ahead.
I don't know if Yi-Chen has any ideas on this, but yeah, I mean, on the whole, you know, when we listen to these videos, I think we're struck by how incredibly mundane credit collection seems to be in China at the moment, you know, and that it is, you know, the agencies will use calls, they'll use letters, they'll use messages to chase people. And then if that doesn't work, they'll move the file, as the video said, to the legal process. The next step is the legal process. And as one of the commenters said, you know, at the end, they just ignore it and let the court decide. And, you know, then we haven't touched on the whole process of blacklisting and all these other things that go on after that, which Yi-Chen's written lots on. So I don't know. Of course, I think there are still, this is by no means the only form of credit there is in China, and there still exists informal credit of all kinds, and lots of other practices that maybe are closer to the ones that Nicholas is describing. But I think the ones that, you know, our Anti-Credit Collection Alliance are, you know, trying to counter, these seem to be the very, you know, very professionalized, very white, white credit kind that you could say, where it's, you know, actually this kind of mundane, bureaucratic, although also very emotional process of debt collection.
Great. Yi-Chen, you have a response?
I think, I think Nicholas asked a very profound question. Because so to answer the last question about Chinese debtors afraid of being identified and tracked, so that's one of the reasons why these people form alliances in the beginning, because, you know, their contact books are often kind of blurred by those debt agencies, because, you know, while they are applying for those small credits, they have to fill in their phone numbers, and then the apps would, you know, immediately track the phone numbers, call histories, contact books, and then they will contact everyone in the person's contact book to kind of make threatening calls in the beginning. But now it's kind of becoming more regulated and civilized to some extent. And then I think somehow the question reminds me of the nature of social media, you know, that could be very different from each other. So for example, on Facebook, most people are, you know, with their real names. And then if you join a Facebook group, people kind of recognize who you are and, you know, your real identity. But in many cases, for example, in China's social media like WeChat and QQ, where people form groups, people don't usually use their real names. And I think that's one of the reasons people could actually form very kind of anonymized groups there to feel the sense of security.
Great, thank you so much, Yi-Chen, for you know, adding more information. Tom, as well, it's wonderful to hear your research. I really enjoy it, and I'm sure the audience too. I mean, at one point we have over 40 people, which was like phenomenal. So it's, I wish we could continue. Like, for example, I would really like to get to know more about debt collection and people's refusal to pay debt and how that impact the social credit system. You know, this whole social credit system is a huge thing. You know, you're not allowed to go on the train or the plane. In one of the videos that you played, it mentioned a little bit. I wish I could go back to it, but we are coming to the end, and I just want to thank everyone for taking the time to join our seminar. Thank you, Tom, so much. Hope to have coffee with you next time I'm in Hong Kong, and Yi Cheng as well. Like, lovely to hear that, you know, your research on P2P lending and then now on debt collection through calling from Tom. So I feel like you know, I get to know this area a lot more just by 2 seminars. So thank you so much. And I hope you have a wonderful, what day is it today? Actually, Thursday.
Thursday, yeah. Thank you, Tom. Thank you, Yi-Chen. Thank you a lot.
Thank you all for the wonderful questions and feedback. Yeah. Really great. Thank you.
So I think our next talk is with our very own Gonzalo and with your colleague as well. So is it?
Yeah, with Suzanne Gottschalk, Shiaki Shirai, and myself, we're going to be talking about childbirth in China and Japan on March the 12th. Yeah.
Okay, so stay tuned. I'll keep the information up on social media. Follow us on Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn. So have a good day. Thank you very much.
Okay.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.